This is The Reason interview with Nick Gillespie, where I go deep with the artists, activists, entrepreneurs, policymakers, and visionaries who are making the world a more libertarian, or at least a more interesting place by championing something like free minds and free markets. My guest today is Katie Herzog. She's co-host of the popular Blocked and Reported podcast and author of the absolutely paradigm-shattering new book, Drink Your Way Sober. Katie writes about her and other people's experiences with something called the Sinclair Method. This is a medication-assisted approach to alcoholism where you use one drug to counter problematic use of another drug. Her story and the cutting-edge research and treatment she reports on upends just about everything we think we know about drug use, recovery, and autonomy. We talk about Naltrexone. This is the drug that helped her retrain her brain, about why Alcoholics Anonymous works for some people, including myself, but not for others, and how modern medicine is finally catching up to the idea that we should treat adults like adults when it comes to what we put in our own bodies. We also get into the insane cancel culture politics that gave rise to her and Jesse Singal starting the Blocked and Reported podcast in 2020. Whether we've passed peak woke, and whether conservatives are now simply presiding over their own version of cancel culture. Here is The Reason interview with Katie Herzog. Katie Herzog, thanks for talking to Reason.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
Drink Your Way Sober is a phenomenal book, and I say that as somebody who blurbed it because I, like you,
I paid you.
Yes, that's right. Like you, I went through a phase where I really couldn't stop drinking, and it was becoming a problem. And, I guess to start with, the book is about something called the Sinclair Method. And this, you use Naltrexone, which is a drug that is used to kind of minimize drug cravings for things like opioids as well as drinking. Can you very quickly just sketch out what the Sinclair Method is?
Yeah, so it's based on this drug, Naltrexone, which is an opioid antagonist, so an opioid blocker. And if you take it in advance of drinking or of doing opioids, you will not get the high associated with that particular substance. And not everyone, I didn't know this sort of going into it. I sort of assumed that alcohol affected people kind of basically the same. It turns out that's not true. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I know there are happy drunks and angry drunks and tired drunks or whatever, but...
And sometimes you can be all of those things in like 5 minutes, right?
So true.
Yeah.
So when I drink alcohol, and I'm curious if this is your experience as well, Nick, I get energized. I get a euphoric high, and it starts even before I start drinking. It's sort of the anticipation of drinking gives me a shot of energy, a real buzz. And it turns out that not everybody gets that. Some people get this sedating effect. And Naltrexone tends to work really well for people like me, people who get that high, because it targets that high. Because it's an opioid blocker, it blocks the endorphin rush that you get, that some people get from alcohol. And so when you drink alcohol on Naltrexone, or at least for me, it becomes very boring. You get sort of the body buzz, the body drunk, that experience of being sort of slurred and sleepy, but you don't get that energy. You don't want to go sing karaoke or whatever. It's just much more sedate. And the Sinclair Method, so this was developed by an American researcher named John David Sinclair. And it's not sort of the typical way that people are generally prescribed Naltrexone. So Naltrexone is becoming a first-line treatment for alcohol use disorder. It's actually not a new drug. It was FDA approved for the treatment of alcoholism in 1994. So it's been FDA approved for over 30 years. It's existed since the 1960s. So not a new substance. Medicine is increasingly looking at medication-assisted therapy. So when you go into your doctor today and you say, I have a drinking problem, you're much more likely to get a prescription for a medication than you would have been 20 years ago when I first started seeking help for my own drinking.
Yeah. And a lot of the times with Naltrexone, though, you're still prescribed, from what I understand. Yeah. They'll say, okay, take it when you wake up in the morning, which is not quite what the Sinclair Method indicates or advocates.
Exactly. So the big difference between sort of the typical prescribing schedule and the Sinclair Method is that you only take Naltrexone on the Sinclair Method in advance of drinking. So if you're not drinking, you don't take it. On days when you're not drinking, no naltrexone.
Yeah.
And the theory is that this leaves on alcohol-free days, this leaves your opioid receptors unblocked. And so that's a way for you to sort of change your life in healthier ways. So you do things that would create sort of a natural endorphin rush, exercise, good conversation, food, sex, if you can find someone to have sex with you, things like that. So you're trying to rewire your brain. So the Sinclair method is the targeted use of naltrexone.
How hard is that to maintain? Because this is kind of like, I assume it's something. I also like to eat a lot, and I assume it's like somebody taking a drug that will help them digest cheese or avoid the the negative effects of beans or something like that. I mean, what you're asking alcoholics, people who have a drinking problem, to say, okay, an hour before you start drinking, make sure you take your pill. Is how much does that fuck up the actual regime of doing the Sinclair method?
That's the hardest part, is compliance. And the difference between taking like Beano or whatever is that Beano doesn't make the experience of cheese worse. Naltrexone does make the experience of cheese. Maybe cheese too. I've never tried the Sinclair method for cheese. Maybe I should. But it does make the experience of drinking less pleasurable. It wasn't that hard for me to stay compliant because I was in sort of desperation mode, and I knew that nothing was going to be easier than taking a pill and having a drink. I needed to get control over my drinking, and the next step, if this didn't work, was rehab. I really didn't want to go to rehab. If it had been like Passages Malibu, maybe I would have been more open to the experience.
I think that must be responsible for at least 50% of problem drinking. Those ads for Passages. It looks pretty nice.
But I was looking at like Hazelden, Betty Ford, and St. Paul. This was not going to be on a beach somewhere.
I want to come back to kind of rehab and also other ways of combating alcoholism or substance use disorder. I guess alcohol use disorder as it's called now. But if we can, one of the things that I love about the book, besides the fact that it is so adult in the sense of like it's about, okay, we all use drugs all the time for all different reasons. We want to look a certain way, we want to feel a certain way. We want to perform sexually a certain way or on a math test or whatever.
Yes.
And this is to me, your book, as well as the growth in kind of the Sinclair method being more popular in the U.S., is part and parcel of this longer story of America becoming more comfortable with the fact that we're all going to use drugs and we're all modulating our consciousness all the time. But one of the other things that's fantastic about the book is that you are constantly stressing that we're individuals in the way that we fuck ourselves up as well as in the way that we succeed and things like that. And one of the things, and again, I say this as somebody who had a real drinking problem. I don't drink anymore, and I stopped using AA. We can talk about AA versus other methods in a while, but it took me forever to realize that when I was drinking, and I started drinking in college, my friends might drink more than me in a given evening, but it was just affecting them in an incredibly different way. Can you talk a little bit about your experience as a drunk, as an alcoholic? I don't know exactly if you have a preferred term or no term for that, but at one point you've been drinking since you were a preteen, right? I think you say you start drinking around age 12 or whatever. But at one point in the book, you were recounting you were looking forward to dying from alcoholism, and you said I die young.
Looking forward is quite the right term, but
well,
expected.
It wasn't. And you write, I would die young, but on the plus side, at least I figured I'd be drunk. Talk about. What was it like to drink, and why did you keep doing it despite a lengthening catalog of really bad outcomes from drinking too much?
At first, it was all pleasure, all fun. Drinking, the effect on me is not like a full personality transplant, but it heightens, or I think at least, it heightens the good things about me and minimized the bad things about me. So I was super social when I was drinking. And I think people who know me now are surprised to hear this because I'm so antisocial. I'm basically a hermit, getting more so every day. But when I was in my social drinking years, so this was in my teens, 20s, and earlier 30s, I was fun. I was wild. I was the person that you would call if you wanted to have a crazy night. I was your wingman, your go-to, very uninhibited. And that's not sort of who I am naturally. Alcohol really was the fuel for that. Extremely talkative, a loudmouth. Although that sort of, one thing that I've learned since getting sober is that, my personality has changed somewhat, but there are some things that haven't changed, like incorrigible gossip when I drank, incorrigible gossip sober. That hasn't changed at all. That's just in me. But I was really fun in those years. And then in the later years, my drinking became much more private, much more secretive, not dark and depressing. I would sort of, when I drank by myself, I still felt good. I felt happy. It's just that I was doing it in secret, so in those, and this was mostly during COVID.
Yeah. Why you were doing it in secret? It was COVID. I mean, you were married, you had a job, right? I mean, you were doing Blocked and Reported the podcast. Well, your job pays pretty well. So,
it does.
But you couldn't be, I don't know, like Peter O'Toole or like a famous actor who has to be drunk in every public, appearance.
No, not in public appearances, for sure. And in fact, I wouldn't drink during public appearances. And one of the reasons is because for me, drinking was always really intertwined with smoking, with cigarettes. And unfortunately, we have reached a point in American culture when that is unacceptable behavior. And I knew I've always done this, when I drank, I have such intense cravings for cigarettes that I would not drink in situations where I was not able to smoke, because I would be overwhelmingly distracted by the desire to leave whatever I was doing and go smoke.
What do you think was driving, you said, and you've talked about, like, you don't have any real kind of, trauma or something that explains why you started drinking really very young and so intensely. What explains your love of alcohol?
I think it's genetic. I think that's it. I come from my parents are not alcoholics, but I come from my mom has a big Irish Catholic family. There's a lot of drinking going back many years in that family. I think that's it. I think I have a genetic predisposition. As to why that is, I don't know. There are theories, that drinkers have larger numbers of whatever receptors that increases the pleasurableness of drinking. So that I do know that, like my wife Jana, when she drinks, we don't have the same experience of drinking. I have seen her drunk maybe once in the 10 years that we have been together. She just does not experience it the same way that I do.
And it's weird when you see people who are enjoying themselves and then they're like, oh, that's enough.
I'm done. I'm like, what's wrong with you?
What is that? Yeah. Right. It's very strange. Do you think it's also, are there, early experiences that are positive that keep you coming back? And, it's kind of like operant conditioning, right?
Yes.
Where it's certain behaviors get rewarded and, that just starts a lifelong pattern that's very hard to break.
Yeah, it's a learned behavior. So there are several risk factors for developing what's now called alcohol use disorder. I'm fine with the term alcoholism, but some people, of course, bristle at that. And some of those factors are, a genetic predisposition. I have that. Early exposure, I have that. I had I got drunk for the first time when I was in middle school, and repeated exposure, repeated experience. So I have those three risk factors. I don't have other risk factors, like, for instance, trauma, and there are other, comorbidities that are involved in this. People with unstable childhoods may be more likely to develop drug and alcohol problems later on. That wasn't my experience, but I do have those three risk factors. And I think in my case, it was just trying. It was just repeated exposure. I loved drinking from a very young age, and I always knew that at some point, not always. I do remember very distinctly thinking when I was like 16 years old, and I lived in that. This was during the period of my life when I was young and dumb enough to think that everyone else in the world was going to die except for me. I thought that I was going to be immune from everything. I think that's a very common experience. You just cannot conceptualize yourself not existing. And so you just assume it won't happen. And I distinctly remember thinking, I'm so glad I could never be an alcoholic because then I would have to quit, which is probably, should have been the first sign that I was a budding alcoholic.
Yeah.
But later in life, when I was in college, my favorite thing to do when I was in college, when I got my first house, was to sit on my porch and read the New Yorker and chain smoke and drink. I loved that. That was like the ideal day for me.
What was so good about that?
The New Yorker in those days, oh my God, just oh, you mean the drinking?
Yeah. Or the smoking, for that matter, which has never appealed to me. But
I don't know what was so good about it. I just loved the way that it made me feel. I just loved it. And I was also very social. So I lived in houses with people. This was most of I lived in very heavy drinking communities. And I like that about my communities.
Can I ask, I know a couple of people who, therapists, psychiatrists, and psychologists who treat people with addiction issues. And most of them will say, people who are addicts, they have some deep reservoir of self-hatred or contempt for themselves. And were you hiding from anything? You're a lesbian, but you're pretty open about that, and you're young enough where you grew up where that was, sexuality is always complicated, but it's not like you're not like a Republican legislator from Idaho, born in 1940 or something.
No, I really, I did hate myself in some of those years as a result of my drinking, but that was why, because my life was, as they say in AA, I had my life was unmanageable.
Yes, that's right. Right. Yeah. And you kept losing jobs and things like that.
Right. So that was so the hatred came from that. I don't think that I have, I'm surprisingly well-adjusted for a podcaster. I really don't have trauma. I really don't have hang-ups about sexuality.
Yeah.
I'm also not introspective at all. I don't like thinking about myself. So I'm not I have anxiety. I'm a little bit neurotic, but I'm not a stewer about my own problems. So I'll think about other people's problems, not mine.
Yeah, that's you skipped that part of the Irish experience, right?
And the lesbian experience too. I don't process. Yeah.
That's fascinating. When did you become a writer exactly? And how does that factor into it? Because there's certainly a romance of writing and alcoholism, and you were not always an author of articles and whatnot.
Right. In fact, I have only recently become an author of books. I'm an author as of 2 weeks.
That's right.
I studied writing in college. I started writing in high school. That was kind of the thing that I was best at in school, has always been writing. And I come from a family of writers, not not journalists or magazine writers or whatever, but everyone in my family has published in some capacity. My dad's written a book. My brother has written a manuscript that hopefully will be published. Both my sister and my mom have written articles. So writing has always been a very, sort of the obvious path forward. I didn't start getting paid for writing until I was in my maybe late 20s when I started doing some freelancing. I studied writing in college, but I never really thought that would be a viable professional path for me. So I did it sort of for pleasure. I kept a blog. I did things like that. And I do think that thinking of having an identity as a writer did sort of help me excuse some of my drinking because, why not? You
need material, right?
Right. And honestly, my first sort of committed writing project was a blog that I kept in my 20s that was about sort of misadventures and all of which had to do with drinking. So from kind of the very first time I started having readers, I was writing about this part of my life and somehow not being like, this is a problem.
You in the book, and it's a real tour de force of both kind of certain elements of memoir, and it's personal, but it's not narcissistic or exhibitionist. And then you obviously you layer in a lot of really fascinating research and reporting because you talk to a lot of other people who have had different experiences. One thing that's kind of missing is, the sexual dimension of your drinking.
Yes.
A lot of your drinking takes place at bars. A lot of things happen at bars, including,
Yes.
Sex and hookups. Why did you choose not to write about that?
Yeah.
And how would that change the narrative, do you think?
I didn't write about that at all. Like, sex is completely absent from the book. And I do think this is a disservice to the reader, because naltrexone does have an effect on one's sex life. And I just left that out because I knew my parents were going to read it. It's like that is 100% it.
So when they kick, then we can get the full version, right?
So I sent my parents a copy of the book, and I sent, I put a little Post-it on it. You don't have to read this. If you do, feel free. I'm happy to answer any questions. Don't worry, no sex stuff. My mom read it, and then she redacted it for my dad, I hope with a Sharpie, because there are still some passages I think that would be painful for any parent to read, because you don't want to worry about your child.
Right.
And also I think it's especially weird because you're like learning about this shit in a book that has been published. But I do think that I'm just, I'm pretty, at this stage of my life, I'm prudish, and I was not prudish in my drinking years. I promise you that. I was an exhibitionist in many ways, but I just couldn't write about it. And I also think the thing about sex is other people are typically involved, and it would have felt a bit of a betrayal to write about, even if I wouldn't have used anybody's names, to write about other people's experiences in that particular way.
But you have enough online enemies where people, an army of people would have been hunting down who you were talking about.
I did a lot to cover my footprint, and part of that, because I was concerned about that, and part of that was, there are no pictures of anybody on my social media besides me and my wife and our dog. I had erased from the internet all of my early writings, because I did not want that to happen. I did not want, the locations in the book are obscured. I did not want people to go back and start digging into my past and finding and approaching people from my past. And unfortunately, the book, I don't think has sold well enough so that at this point, that's a risk. But I did cover my tracks.
When did you know? At various points you talk about, you knew you had a problem, and the first place a lot of people start when they have a drinking problem. I suspect, maybe this was just me, but I think that's very common. First, you're like, okay, well, I'm just going to stop drinking, and I will use the same willpower that has somehow kept me drinking all the time to stop drinking. And then when that fails, you hear about AA and things like that. What were your early experiences with Alcoholics Anonymous?
So I went to my first AA meeting at 24. This was shortly after my first really serious breakup. And
which was due in large part, from my drinking. It's always complicated, but drinking is always either the gasoline on the fire or the fire itself, right?
Exactly. And lesbian breakups are notoriously high drama. This fell into that category. So very loud, angry, public breakup, very disruptive breakup to my life. And so I had my first sort of oh shit moment during this breakup. I went to a psychiatrist. I was hoping to get a diagnosis for some sort of mental health disorder. I did not want a diagnosis of alcoholism, and the psychiatrist obliged. She told me that I was an alcoholic and bipolar. He was wrong about one of those. I'm not bipolar. But I started. But
that's what you were hoping for, right?
Yes.
Is that it's not the drinking; it's some other serious defect of character or brain chemistry or something.
Right, because being bipolar would mean it wasn't my fault, right? And also maybe it would mean that I wouldn't have to quit drinking, because that was the fear, was that I was going to have to quit drinking, because I literally could not imagine my life without alcohol. Yeah. And so I went to my first AA meeting around that time. Miserable experience, absolutely hated it, kept going a little bit, but really never committed to it.
Yeah, why was it a miserable experience?
So the first meeting I went to, I was the only person there. There was one woman there, and she was very creepy. I remember like she was a large woman and she was wearing this t-shirt that had it had a teddy bear on it with googly eyes, like eyes so they were like staring at me. And I was crying, I was upset. So it was like having this strange non-therapeutic moment with a complete stranger. She gave me a big book, and then when I was leaving the meeting, a guy came up to me and told me to watch out for her, that she was a predator. So that was my very first experience with AA. And then I went to other meetings later on, and I resented them. I resented the people who were there. I didn't want to quit drinking, and I felt like the people who would talk about how much better their lives were sober, I thought they were lying. I could not imagine my life sober, and definitely not better sober. And oftentimes I would leave a meeting and I would go to a bar. I found that talking about drinking and I just found it made me thirsty. And I wasn't committed to it. I didn't do it right. You know, I felt deeply uncomfortable about the whole thing. You know, the God thing didn't help matters at all. So, I
mean, and the idea that you have to admit that you've lost, your life has become unmanageable,
powerless,
that you're powerless over alcohol, and that you have to surrender to a higher power.
Yes.
And the roots of AA come from religious, a particular kind of Christian fellowship.
Right.
I assume were you raised either atheist or just non-religious? So that
both. Like if there was any religion in my household, it would have been natural selection. My dad and mom were both raised in religious households, and I have like 26 cousins, and no one is religious now. It was sort of one of those situations. So yeah, that I bristled at that, and now I know. You know, since then I have been, even more recently, I've been to meetings for alcohol. Agnostics and atheists of Alcoholics Anonymous. There are lots of people who are in the program are not religious at all, and it can still work for them. But at the time, and maybe this was just an excuse, I just didn't want to be a part of that. Yeah. And mostly, I mean, but the biggest barrier was that AA meant abstinence. And they say it's one day at a time, but everybody knows it's forever. That's the goal, is you don't drink anymore. And that was so unfathomable to me that was the real issue, was that AA did nothing for the physical cravings, for the emotional and mental cravings. It didn't do anything for the desire. And had I stuck with it and committed to it, I think it would have given me the tools to handle those cravings. That's what works for a lot of people. But the desire itself, I wanted the desire gone. Yeah. And I didn't think that AA was ever going to get me to that place. Or if it did, it was going to take a lot of time and a lot of meetings and a lot of work. Right. It sounded hard.
It's interesting. When I finally ended up going to AA, and I've stopped drinking twice in my life, and I think the second time for good. But it took me a long time to even take AA seriously, because my father had been an alcoholic before he had kids, and he would talk about going to AA meetings, and they sounded absurd. Like he described a time where a guy was talking who had claimed to have been the catcher in a high wire act, like an acrobat act, and that he was drunk and dropped somebody who died. Oh, God. And I started laughing when he told me that, and he was like, "Why are you laughing?" And I was like, "That's obviously not true." And but it was
true.
Yeah, it is, I'm sure. And it's also, the big book was, put together in the 30s or something. 30s, and it's like kind of going through Humphrey Bogart movies or something. And in a way, later I found that kind of appealing. It was because people knew how to drink, back in the 30s and 40s for sure, in a way I don't think we do anymore.
It's a lost art.
Yeah. But it's, I also came to realize that AA works for some people. I mean, Reason Magazine ran for, we've been around since '68, and we've run articles all the time about how AA is terrible because it's anti-libertarian, it's anti-individualistic. Yes. You surrender your will, whatever. And it's really not any of those things. People who use it to stop drinking, and it's good for them. Other people use other options.
I would love to see the libertarian version of AA.
Yeah. Well, what there's a group called Refuge Recovery, which is kind of a Buddhist take, And I know many libertarians who are into AA, and you know, because in the end you're making the decision to change your life, and so it's, even if you're saying you know, I'm surrendering my will, or I don't have control, it's a means of gaining control, which is kind of like, you know, what you do with Naltrexone or with the Sinclair Method or whatever. So I find that really interesting, and you know, and I guess what I would like to ask you is, so you've got AA, which works for some people. You've got the Sinclair Method that works for people. Are there other methods of kind of ending problematic drug use that seem to be growing in popularity? And, you know, what are those?
There are a million of them. And I think in a way, this is sort of a reversion to an earlier time, because there have been so many dozens of paths out of addiction throughout the years. And then what happened is basically AA became so successful that it sort of nudged everything out of the way. Right. And I don't think this was, well, it's maybe in some ways it was intentional. In the early years of AA, there was a sort of big marketing push by one particular member. Her name was Marty Mann, just a fascinating character in history. That said, you know, in the foreword to the second edition of the Big Book, there's a sentence about we do not have a monopoly on therapy. So the official line from AA for decades has been, there are many ways. This isn't the only path forward, right. But even though that's in the Big Book, culturally, AA has been such a dominating force that even the medical establishment, I'm generalizing here, right. but you know, doctors that I talked to for years, the advice was get your ass to AA. They never told me about medications. Right. I saw it as one path out of it. This was the message that I absorbed from the culture, from my friends, from professionals. But
there are no movies yet anyway about the Sinclair Method, whereas there's a
but if
TV movie of the
anyone
month
wants to make one,
this, yeah.
I'm open.
Okay, there you go. But you got to put the sex back in.
Yeah,
So,
true. But there are a ton, like I get ads now for an app called Reframe. I get this ad so many times, so often when I open Instagram.
It almost makes you want to start drinking again, so you can use it, right?
And this is, I don't know much about this app. I think it's based on the principles of cognitive behavioral therapy, being mindful of your drinking. A lot of these movements are sort of focused on women for some reason. There's a woman named Annie Grace who self-published a book called This Naked Mind that is all about sort of thinking your way out of alcoholism.
I find that I read that book and I was like, oh, this sounds great. And I found it very unconvincing, partly because this idea, and I suspect that libertarians among many types of people are prone to thinking like, well, you know, what makes me different is that I'm rational and I'm reasonable, and I can just think my way to riches, think and grow rich like Napoleon Hill, or, you know, think and grow sober.
Yes.
You know, but I don't think it really works that way.
It didn't work for me.
Yeah.
The same thing, you know, I tried the Alan Carr book that people swear by, The Easy Way to Quit. They have one for smoking. I know a lot of people who have read this book and never picked up another cigarette. I read it and was like, I can beat you. Try me. There's also one, you know, The Easy Way to Quit Drinking, and that same thing. It's all sort of about thinking your way out of this. You know, some people do hypnotism. Right. There's a sort of growing community called Sober Curious. There's more emphasis now on moderation, this idea that abstinence is not the only way forward. So there's so many more options now. There's a book that's immensely popular for women that I'm forgetting the name of now. I started reading it, and the first pages were about patriarchy, and I was like, well, this one's not going to be for me.
Do you think women and men, I mean, you know, we have broadly different experiences of many aspects of, you know, everyday life, a lot of similarities, of course, but is there something unique to female experience of alcoholism?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, AA started out as men only. It took a long time for women to be, but then again, this was the 1930s, like everything was segregated, and it took a long time for women to be for anyone to acknowledge that women could themselves be alcoholics.
Right.
So Al-Anon came out of AA. This was sort of the group for the women who were affected by their husbands drinking, but women themselves.
And there's a chapter in the big book, like to the wives.
To the wives.
Right? Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, people thought that in the beginning of AA, this was considered a men's problem.
Yeah.
And I have talked to people who have spent a lot of time in AA in the rooms, women who have had really negative experiences because they have found the men in those rooms to be predatory, which is terrible, especially when you're sort of at your lowest. But in terms of the experience of alcoholism, that's a very good question. Women are probably less likely to, beat their wives when they're drunk.
I don't know, lesbians, or at least soccer players
Only
seem to have
because
a
most
really
women
bad
don't have
habit.
wives. That's the only reason.
Yeah, it is. You drank, and then you smoked a lot of weed, right, as a way to kind of hedge drinking, or was your kind of weed abuse, and was it the same as your alcohol abuse, or I tend to think of these things as functional, in functional terms, like you use substances or activities to get to a certain state of mind. And, what was weed doing for you that was better than booze?
Weed was like my daytime pleasure, also nighttime pleasure. I smoked a lot of weed. I think the difference is that weed didn't destroy my life the way that alcohol did, and it didn't take over my mind. So for me, the experience of addiction, or the worst part of addiction, has always been mental. It's this obsessive, compulsive, like worm in my brain that doesn't ever shut up. Like, that's what alcoholism was like for me. In the back of my mind, I was always thinking about drinking, about when I could drink, if I could drink, knowing that I needed to quit. And weed, I didn't have that experience. Like, if I couldn't get weed, which was rare, if I couldn't get weed, I would be maybe a little anxious, and I would go get some weed, but it didn't sort of destroy me the way that alcohol did. And I don't smoke weed. I'm not smoking weed right now because I'm trying to get life insurance. I'll probably smoke again
the minute that the contract clears or something.
I probably will, but I'll smoke a small amount of weed, and I won't smoke it again for a couple weeks. And that has been a completely organic process. I never tried to quit smoking weed. I just gradually, as I've gotten older, I just smoke a lot less. And I was a wake and baker for years. Like, if I was in my house or out of my house, I was smoking weed. I once brought weed to a court date. I walked into, I got a speeding ticket, and I was walking into the courthouse, and I saw they were checking bags, and I was like, I better turn around and take this weed. And this was in North Carolina when it was illegal. I had weed on me all the time. I was a stoner. And that was also a big part of my identity, was that I was a stoner. But then again, like, I also went years without smoking weed. And
do you think that it's, you were talking about the kind of learned behavior. It's just your experiences with weed, or your early exposures, they were just categorically different. So you have a different relationship.
They were, I started smoking weed around that same time. So they weren't categorically different. Weed was definitely harder to get, in North Carolina in the 90s than in my small town. Well, was it harder to get than booze? I'm not sure about that.
Well, it was illegal, right?
It was illegal,
in a way
but so
that
was
it just
alcohol
makes
when I was 15,
Yeah, but alcohol, like, everybody's house probably had alcohol, right?
Yes, that's true. Weed felt more of in the beginning, weed felt more of, it was like an identity thing in a way. I was like a hippie. That was like, I had dreadlocks. I wore lots of hemp necklaces. Weed was almost aesthetic. I was very unfortunate looking. Weed was an aesthetic.
Yeah.
As much an accessory as it was like a drug in a way.
Yeah. Now, you use other drugs, beta blockers, in order to combat anxiety when you do speaking and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because, this is also one of the things that AA rhetoric tends to say, and there's a lot of people like this where, doing any drug is as bad as doing any other drug, and you shouldn't do any drugs. And if you do any drug, you're a drug addict.
Right.
But, you're using beta blockers to kind of overcome certain types of anxiety.
Yeah.
Can you explain what they are and how that functions in your life?
So beta blockers are, the one that I take is called propranolol, and it's a heart medication. I don't know who gets it. I don't know what the sort of symptoms one uses for, I don't know what, sorry, let me start that over. It's a heart medication. I don't know what the sort of cardiac issues that would lead to someone being prescribed this particular thing. I don't have them, whatever it is. So when I do public speaking, not like being on a podcast, but if I'm in front of a big audience, I get this like very adrenalized physical response. So my hands will shake and my voice will shake. And that is not what you want in terms of public speaking. You want to be comfortable. And because of that, I take beta blockers. So beta blockers cut out that adrenaline response. So I'm totally calm when I am on TV or public speaking and I don't like, if I'm doing a podcast, I will only take them if it was like a very live, high pressure show. Like last time I did the Megyn Kelly show, we were talking about Israel, and I took beta blockers before that, and I was glad because when she started screaming at me, I was like, well, this is fine.
Yeah. What kind of drugs do you think she's on?
All of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe just Botox is the one. It's
that's good for headaches too. That has psychoactive effects, apparently.
True.
So beta blockers just, they kind of tamp down the adrenaline response, so you can be more in the moment. Exactly.
And it does cut the sort of the pleasurable high of something like that. So I don't feel. I don't feel sort of buzzy. Like I'll take them before live shows that I do with Jesse or before TV, and I feel very neutral afterwards. Whereas Jesse's like bouncing off the walls. He's so excited, and I'm like, whatever, this is fine. But I sort of need that because the nerves get to me. And the problem with beta blockers, though, I think, is that public speaking is the sort of thing that with repeated exposure, you learn to get better, and the adrenaline would naturally lessen the more that I did it. I won't give myself that opportunity to learn. I'm going to take beta blockers. If I forget.
Were you an athlete at all? Because, this is something, if I played soccer, and I know at the beginning of a match, you would, you're amped up, and a little bit of adrenaline and anxiety helps kind of get you to the point where you're going to be engaged, but too much, then you're kind of out of it. But is it similar to that? Yeah, I think I have like a vagus nerve issue that makes and not Las Vegas, but the vagus nerve is one of these things that nobody knew about until 20 minutes ago, and now we learn that the vagus nerve, which runs all over your body, will. If you massage it right or think the right things, then everything will open up to you.
Something like that. I do have so I have this like very specific and actually fairly debilitating anxiety, which is driving over. It started out as driving over bridges, and I have a large family, and like large extended family, and like half of the women in my family can't drive over bridges. And
sign me up for that. Yeah, I have that same thing. That's why I'm asking you so much about beta blockers, because I want to find out who is your beta blocker dealer, and how do I get that before I have to drive home.
Actually, I my doctor is direct primary care, which I found out about because I was complaining about healthcare on Twitter, and someone sent me a reason video about direct primary care, which is a model that I love. But yes, taking beta blockers before something like that. I don't take them before driving because my fear of driving is that I'm going to pass out, and beta blockers lower my blood pressure, and I don't want to pass out while I'm driving. But my doctor told me that if you sing while you're experiencing it, it has some effect on the vagus nerve, and I have actually found that. So if I'm in a situation driving that I know is going to make me anxious, I put on Taylor Swift and I start badly singing.
Okay, that's disturbing to hear. But, that's it. If it works, it works. Don't knock it, right? Let me try to pirouette from, talking about the book, Drink Your Way Sober, and the way that you have, you've taken control over drinking, over smoking weed, over like negative behaviors, sometimes by by using drugs to combat other drugs, which is fascinating. But like one way to frame what you're talking about is that your life, intentionality is too glib a term for this, but like you're more in control. You're trying to be more in control of the way that you feel during the day, in touch with your body, with your mind, and things like that. You're the co-host of Blocked and Reported, a podcast that started in 2020 with Jesse Singal, and you guys came together partly because you had both been canceled for writing stories about detransitioners, people who had changed genders and then decided to go back to their birth gender or birth sex. Is that large story, is that it partly, is it about people trying to become more comfortable in who they think they are at various points. And certain people who are trans, I know a number of people who transitioned, sometimes with full gender reassignment surgery, and they are much happier. Their lives are not necessarily easier, but they are, they feel more comfortable in themselves. Other people don't feel that way. Are we going through a kind of social evolution where people are really trying to get to, be comfortable and, in their own skin?
I think that if you looked at the first cohorts of young trans children or children with gender dysphoria, I would say yes. The thing is, the cohort has really changed in recent years. So the first kids who were visiting gender clinics were typically natal males, these sort of swishy, faggy boys, basically. Yeah. And that has changed so vastly in the U.S. that now what we're seeing is natal females who are older, who didn't experience gender dysphoria. They weren't the kids who came out of the womb with a softball glove, or maybe they did.
Or
some
a
of them
dump
were
truck
lesbians.
or whatever. Yeah.
Right. They're kids whose onset came either around puberty or after the onset of puberty. And my theory has always been that these girls are following trends. Not all of them, of course. I'm generalizing, and I think that's just. And
you're not saying that pejoratively. You're not saying like they're clout chasers, but it's just that there's a social milieu where it's like, oh, this is going to explain everything.
Is next.
This is going to,
and it's. I think people use terms like, actually, what is the term? Let me think of this. People use terms like contagion, and that is perceived to be negative. I don't mean that to be negative. We are social creatures. Everything that we do is influenced by the people around us. There's nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, it would be bizarre and antisocial to not be influenced by the people around us. And so I think for that population, the motivations are just really different from the kids who sort of have that classic gender dysphoria. The boys who put a towel on their head to mimic having hair. That's a really common sort of early sign that a kid might have gender dysphoria. That's not the sort of thing that like a 3-year-old didn't learn that in preschool, right?
Right.
So yeah, and then there's this other element which is more taboo, but autogynephilia, the idea that for some people, transition is a type, basically a sexuality. And maybe that has some degree of, maybe comfort is the right word there, but I just think the populations are distinct. We have different typologies for trans people, and for some of them, yes, comfort is obviously paramount, and for others, it's frankly about getting off. Yeah.
Which is also not a bad thing, right? And certainly when we're,
it depends how you have it.
Yeah. But when we're talking about adults and consenting adults, really anything, I think anything should go, and then things get more complicated when you're talking about children for a variety of reasons.
Right. And when you're talking about single-sex spaces and things like that.
Right. Do you feel like the shift from, kind of like trans stuff being, very odd or people didn't want to talk about it or it was hush-hush, to then it became a huge social issue in the teens, really. And then, there's the moment that, engulfed you and Jesse, where if you said anything negative or what was perceived as negative, your Seattle Stranger story, which came out in 2017 about detransitioning, I remember I had heard about this story and I read a story. I read it and I was like, oh, where's the story where you are negative or hostile towards trans people? Because it's an incredibly empathetic story. But, that kind of sense where, like, if you said anything negative about trans anything, you were going to be canceled. Like, clearly we're past that, right?
Oh, yeah. We've gone full circle. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways, the increased visibility of trans as an identity, we went through this period of, I was a kid in the 90s, you're home sick from school, you're watching Sally Jesse Raphael or Jerry Springer, and there's this sort of chick with a dick narrative. Trans people were seen as very freakish. And then we go through this sort of mini revolution, the trans tipping point. There's this brief moment where public opinion is on the side of trans people. There's shows like
Laverne Cox was on
the cover of Time.
Transparent, or the show with Jeffrey Tambor.
Yes,
and then of course Caitlyn Jenner. I wrote a story for the Daily Beast, and I still believe this, that the ultimate all-American success story is Bruce Jenner, who defeated the Soviet Union during the '76 Olympics, becoming Caitlyn Jenner. That's the ultimate American story, right? Where you can be whoever you want to be if you work hard. Yeah.
A Republican of all people.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And so, there was that brief moment where trans people had this stage. I'm originally from North Carolina. In 2016, I wasn't living there at the time, but in 2016, when then Governor Pat McCrory tried to pass this bathroom bill that was going to force trans people to use their natal sex in public accommodations, public bathrooms, huge backlash, economic fallout from that. Pat McCrory, who had been fairly popular in North Carolina, he lost his reelection bid. And then what I think happened is that trans activists ruined it for them. I think they just pushed and they pushed and they pushed, and it wasn't just about bathrooms or public accommodations or jobs, all of which they won.
Right.
It was about kids and sports and the denial that there are differences between the sexes. I think that people like Chase Strangio, the famed ACLU trans lawyer, did so much damage to his own cause, because Chase is not an assimilationist. He's a liberationist, right? He wants...
Can you explain the distinction that you're making there?
Right. So there's a contingent, a wing of queer and trans activists who do not want the sort of what we consider sort of the... Let me start that over. Who do not want what we consider the sort of normal, for lack of a better term, American life. You actually would probably get along very well with these people. We're talking about people whose ideal dream, it's not the American dream. It's not the house with the picket fence and the 2.5 kids and all of that stuff. They want revolution. They want the dismantling of the nuclear family. They think monogamy is very cringe. They're just radical. And these are circles that I came up in, so I understand this thinking.
This would include early kind of ACT UP activists, gay rights activists who would say, we don't want gay marriage. That is, we're fighting against marriage. It's something very different than that. Exactly. So those are the liberationists, and there's such a conflict between what they want and what normies see as desirable and healthy and good. And the problem is that, I think in part because of the internet, in large part because of the internet, those radical pockets went mainstream. And when this is like the life and the values of your San Francisco polycule, that's one thing. But when this impacts
public opinion, when it stops being just within your enclave, within your little cohort of radicals, and it goes mainstream, other people are going to judge it, and that's going to affect public opinion. And so I think in some ways, oddly, I think trans people would have been better off without this sort of trans tipping point, because like I've known trans people for my entire adult life. They used to be able to live more stealth if that's what they wanted, because nobody was aware of trans people. And now everybody's, masculine women are being transvestigated, It's just such a common thing that now people are sort of hyper aware of it.
But hopefully that Macron's wife will be able to live openly as a trans person, right? If
don't get sued. Yeah, so I think activists, I think the two particular issues, and this to me seems so obvious. I think I was right that this was going to play out how it did, but it just seems so obvious that specifically on the issues of sports and kids, trans activists were going to lose on these issues, and that was going to take the whole movement back, and I think that's what we're seeing now.
But there is something insane, right, when conservatives like, and I'm thinking back to the North Carolina bathroom bills and things like that, where it's like, shouldn't Target or, Walmart or a private company, shouldn't they be able to say, like, who can use which bathroom? Or maybe we can go back to the absolute norm in American culture before about 1930, which is that all public places, restaurants and things like that just had bathrooms and people used them. When Nancy Mace, who I guess is South Carolina, not North Carolina, but the way when people like that grandstand about how she's not going to use the same bathroom or, as like a trans member of Congress, there's like a psychosis there. It seems to me like there's a, just a discrimination and a prejudice. And, I'm always uncomfortable when people are clearly working out their own psychoses in public.
Right.
How do we avoid that, as well as, the more extreme versions of trans activism where, I think vastly most people are actually really happy with a liberationist take, like live how you want and you don't get to enlist me in your crusade involuntarily. But Americans are actually pretty wide open about nobody really cares how people live as long as you're not forcing other people to participate.
Right. I think that's the issue, is it's the forcing other people to participate. And right now we're in such a weird place in American politics and culture where it's just this pendulum swinging back and forth, getting more extreme on either side. What I want is just people to be fucking normal. I mean that trans activists stop trying to convince everybody that sex doesn't matter, that a 3-year-old who says that they're trans knows what they're talking about. Just be fucking normal. And the right also be fucking normal and be compassionate. And, I've seen this within gender critical spaces as well. This gender critical spaces, what people are commonly referred to as TERFs, have also gotten more extreme. The sort of figureheads of that movement have gotten more extreme, less compassionate. J.K. Rowling, she sort of came out as gender critical a few years ago. She wrote this thing, dress however you want, just be whoever you want. Just don't try to force it on other people. That's the standard that I would like to get to. And that's the standard we seem to be getting farther away from.
The only way I feel bad for J.K. Rowling is that the only kid from the Harry Potter movies who she's made into like bazillionaires who defends her is the kid who played Draco Malfoy. That just,
Right.
Do you worry that in the push to go back to normie culture or normcore or something like that, that's actually going to start rolling back gains made for gays and lesbians to live however they want?
I do. I see this happening. I see homophobia online, not as much in real life, but more online than I have since the 90s. And then, of course, in the 90s, it was in real life. I wasn't online. But, same thing with racism, overt racism, overt anti-Semitism. Twitter is a cesspool. It's unfortunate. It turns out the guardrails actually did make it
right.
make it
do you,
a more pleasant place
do you
to be.
have any sense of, and in Blocked and Reported, how many episodes have you guys done now? Because
we've done like 280 free episodes and maybe twice that in terms of, I don't know. I don't know the math. We've done hundreds of episodes.
Okay. And it's funny because I interviewed you and Jesse in, I think, June of 2020. So it was a few months after you had started. And I remember talking with the guy at Reason, and he was like, oh, yeah, it's a good show. But like, what are they going to do after, 3 weeks? Because there's, it's the same thing over and over again, but it isn't. There's an infinite amount of internet nonsense, particularly from the left. But, it's also on the right. Do you have a sense of like, how do we get to a place not where people agree because, they're not going to, nor should we agree. I mean, it's a big country, and just as we process alcohol differently, we're going to process life differently.
True.
And we're going to use different drugs to deal with it. Is there a way to bring back that kind of pluralism and tolerance, which, for me, that's what defines libertarianism. It's what defines the best elements, both of a certain type of conservatism and liberalism or progressivism. But, where do we go? Is there a way forward in a world where the Trump administration has people foaming at the mouth all the time about, if you eat tacos in public, you're going to get picked up by ICE. And then, there's a bunch of people on the left who want to, have, I don't know, state takeover of grocery stores and things like that.
I don't know. I'm sure there are some historic parallels here that we could look to. I'm fairly ignorant as to history, however. Yeah. Did you listen to Megyn Kelly on the Fifth Column? Yeah,
I did.
So she said something in that episode that I found really telling, and I think is indicative of her kind of, not just her, but of a lot of people who sort of are on her team, as it were. Although it's unfortunate, this is, you sort of think of politics as a team sport. But she was talking about punishment. They did this to us. They, meaning the left. They did this, and now we are punishing them. And she seems to think that or the good faith interpretation of what she said was sort of, we'll go through these two extremes. We have cancel culture on the left, wokeness on the left, and then anti-wokeness on the right, cancel culture on the right. And maybe after enough punishment has been meted out by right-wingers, then we can go back to normal. I think that's fucking ludicrous. I think that is
like Stephen Miller is going to go back to his farm after he's kicked out enough immigrants or something. Right.
I just don't think that's how it's going to work. I think that the response to everything that's happening on the right, when eventually right-wingers do lose power, is that we're going to see an equal and opposite reaction on the left. That said, I have been pleased that I think that leftists are not taking the bait as much as I would have predicted after the Trump election. I thought we were going to see a real resurgence of protest culture on the left, of violent protest culture, and the crackdowns on this would be swift and immense and terrible. And instead, what we're seeing is, like in Portland, we aren't seeing a ton of anti-fascist violence. We're seeing old hippies with their peace signs outside of ICE. Not
and
that is stopping.
Terrible folk songs, which are not good, but
But bring them back. That's what I want to see,
Yeah.
There's I just moved, but the town that I moved from, every month or so there would be a sort of protest at the local roundabout, and it was mostly retirees, people who had been involved in these movements in the 60s, and their grandkids just holding their signs, honk for whatever. I think that's great. I mean, who knows what's going to happen, but I've been pleased to see that other than on some campuses where Israel-Palestine shit has gotten kind of violent, I think that my prediction that we would see this big resurgence in stupid leftist activism has been proven wrong.
Yeah. And, in a way, just as an advertisement for Blocked and Reported, one of the things I've gone to a couple of public shows you guys have done and things, and the audience is fascinating because I would argue, it's probably mostly people who kind of are ostensibly center left looking towards the progressive end, and they can kind of accept the excesses of their own side. and kind of be like, yeah, we don't want to be that. And, and they get along with a lot of, it's a very kind of ecumenical group that shows up to those things. And that seems to be the beginning of something different than just like, you did this to me, so now I'm going to do it to you. And we just keep ping-ponging back and forth.
Yeah, and we haven't, Jesse and I have no strategy. We we don't have meetings. We just got a calendar last year where we write down what we're going to do on the next week, which I highly recommend if anybody isn't familiar with that particular technology. Write shit down. It's very helpful in terms of planning. But we have, I think, just by sort of being who we are, which is basically two normies. I mean, we are online, but Jesse and I are not radical. We have cultivated an audience that has similar values. And we also, we try to maintain our values and not let the audience and the numbers change what we do.
Yeah,
right? And that's
hard
tough.
though, right? Yeah.
Yes. If we had leaned into sort of lives of TikTok style or like hardcore anti-trans content, we would have a lot more money.
Yeah.
That's the extremes pay. And I think you can see this in Megyn Kelly's show. When Megyn Kelly started this podcast, she had Jesse and I on, much more moderate. As the show has gotten bigger, she has gotten more extreme. And she's also much more, she's much bigger than she was when she was trying to sort of be the reasonable centrist.
How much would you, with your, with your work, it seems to me part of what keeps you grounded is the fact that you still do a lot of reporting. Like, you have thoughts and things like that, but then, when you're doing episodes of Blocked and Reported or when you're writing, like you're actually talking to people. And that kind of engagement with something that passes for reality seems to actually be a pretty good anchor so that you don't become, totally lost in your own excesses.
Yeah. I'm also, my real life is pretty offline. I am in communities where I am sort of in the minority. So we just moved to a new town, not even a town, it's a very rural area, but I have this experience fairly often of people meeting me and making vast assumptions about my politics based on the fact that, I'm married to a woman. People just assume. They just assume that, like, I think that J.K. Rowling is...
Is it too late in history for Indigo Girls jokes? Do you get
never.
Like, here's honestly, my Indigo Girls collection. You can have it. I'm not using it anymore.
Exactly.
That type of thing.
So, I have that experience of people... frankly, usually straight people making these just like real assumptions about me, and that I think keeps me grounded in a way, because I am sort of listening to other people reflect back what they think about me and just sort of nodding along. And the town that we just moved from was a Navy town, so it was a lot more sort of politically diverse. And so there, a lot of the people I knew were conservative, not super conservative. Like, this was Washington State, not Western Washington, not Texas.
Yeah, or Eastern Washington, or
Eastern
the Idaho
Washington.
Pan stovepipe or something. Yeah.
Yes, true. So my actual community is fairly politically diverse. I tend to keep my mouth shut because I am oftentimes, if I'm hanging out with my in-laws who are probably voted for Trump, although they would never say this, I'm like the far left. And if I'm hanging out with my neighbors who would have, who probably voted for Bernie, they all think I'm like the most conservative person they've ever met. And I think that's good, that I like not being surrounded by people who agree with me, I think is good.
Yeah. Just to end and to bring it back to Drink Your Way Sober, you had talked earlier about how, there was a period when you could not even, envision a life where you're sober, but you're sober now, you don't drink, you're not smoking weed. What is it like? Is it actually better? And how would you... Is there anything, do you think, that you could say to your earlier self where it'd be like, no, really, it's better not constantly thinking about, do I have enough liquor? Am I drunk enough? Am I going to be drunk? All of that.
I got to get some on the way home. The store's about to close. It's 1:55. I got to get to, It's so much better. If I were 25 looking at me at 42, I would be like, she is so lame. That girl is so uncool. What the fuck happened to you? You know, my day is spent doing normal shit. I work, I hang out with my family, I spend a lot of time with the dog. I have a wood burning stove now, so I'm spending a lot of time chopping wood. I have a lot of land now. I'm getting involved with like local, not political stuff, but sort of like local organizing stuff, not to save the world, but because let me take that up. Let me start that over. I'm involved in local volunteer. Let me start that over. I'm involved with my local community to a small degree. My life is so peaceful now and so calm, and I'm really happy right now.
Is that something you have to work through, though? I mean, because, you know, I mean, obviously you never want to say, well, somebody is an addict and they're going to have to go through, you know, a long, dark night of the soul and all that. But, you know, can you get there? Can you get there by, you know, without having to experience both the highs of addiction and the lows of addiction?
Absolutely. I think I think people generally do get there without experiencing that. I do think that I think I have like a baseline level of happiness, and that doesn't vary that much. You know, so we just bought a new house and moved out to the woods. I had like I sort of a spike of happiness after that happened, and now I'm back to the baseline, right? Which is a pretty good baseline. Like not super anxious, not depressed, but it's also true that I don't experience those real highs that I was experiencing when I was 25, you know, when I was single or dating and having crazy adventures. But I also don't experience those lows. And I think that if I were still experiencing those highs, at least in that sort of chemical addiction, my life would be so unstable that it would not be worth it. And the other thing is, like, if you're still doing the shit that you were doing at 25, you're not growing up. You know, and I knew a lot of people who never grew up, and a lot of them are dead now. You know, and so it's a trade-off. And so I am sort of coming to terms with aging and not being cool and fun anymore. But that's a price I'm willing to pay. Yeah. I mean, you have maintained a very cool lifestyle despite being sober and old, but I'm not old. A man, so.
Yeah. Well, without, this is a podcast about you, so we're going to leave it
Let's
there.
Do you next time.
Okay, absolutely.
We're talking about Burning Man.
But Katie Herzog, the book is Drink Your Way Sober. The podcast is Blocked and Reported. Where is the best place for people to check up on you?
Western Washington, about 2 hours west of Seattle. The podcast is, I'm not really participating in social media anymore. So the podcast, blockedandreported.org, I believe.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Katie.
Thanks, Nick. Good to see you.